NATO on edge. Russia's growing power threatens to collapse the West's defense line. The silence inside NATO's headquarters in Brussels was more ominous than any explosion. It was the kind of silence that settled when powerful people no longer had words, only fear. A silence that echoed through war rooms, down corridors lined with flags of member nations, through closed chambers where generals and diplomats stared at maps and satellite images that showed one undeniable truth. Russia was preparing for something, and the West had no unified answer. The images were clear. Armored divisions moving along railway lines in western Russia. Mobile Iskander missile systems positioned near Kaliningrad. Naval fleets mobilizing in the Baltic Sea. Long-range bombers crisscrossing Arctic airspace. And perhaps most chilling, radio silence from Moscow. There were no statements, no justifications. Just movements. Calculated, deliberate, and coordinated. Inside European capitals, fear gripped the air like fog. In Berlin, emergency briefings were held under the cover of night. In Warsaw, military convoys rolled through city streets as civilians watched in anxious silence. In Vilnius, sirens tested early warning systems. The Baltic states had always feared they'd be the first to fall in the event of confrontation with Russia. Now that fear felt dangerously close to reality. Meanwhile, in Moscow, there was no panic, no confusion, only confidence. President Vladimir Putin, flanked by his defense chiefs and intelligence officers, reviewed satellite intelligence of NATO's hesitant troop movements. He saw what they feared, that NATO was not ready, not politically, not militarily, and certainly not emotionally. He knew they were divided. He had spent years ensuring it. The seeds had been planted long ago, through cyber campaigns, political influence operations, and energy manipulation. Russia didn't need to fire a shot to weaken NATO. It only needed to make the West question itself. And now those doubts were blooming into paralysis. French politicians argued against military provocation. German leaders called for diplomacy, citing energy dependency. Hungary refused to engage. The United States, stretched thin between Asia and domestic unrest, sent mixed signals. Would they intervene? Would they risk another war? Nobody could say for sure. In this vacuum of clarity, Russia thrived. The psychological pressure campaign intensified. Disinformation flooded social media in multiple languages. Fake NATO communiques appeared online. Panic rumors spread about Russian troops disguised as civilians in Poland. Deepfake videos portrayed NATO commanders issuing false attack orders. The public, overwhelmed and confused, lost trust in every narrative. Who was attacking who? Was it even happening? In this fog of digital war, truth was irrelevant. Fear was the real weapon, and it was working. In Estonia, local leaders pleaded for more U.S. troops. In Latvia, officials distributed gas masks and iodine pills to civilians. In Lithuania, grain silos were fortified and airports readied for emergency landings. The civilian population, especially the elderly who remembered Soviet rule, prepared for the unthinkable. Underground shelters were cleaned, emergency drills resumed, and supply hoarding quietly began. Then Russia escalated the game further. 3 natural gas pipelines that supplied much of Eastern Europe experienced simultaneous mechanical failures. The Kremlin denied involvement, but everyone knew better. Within 24 hours, rolling blackouts spread through Ukraine, Poland, Slovakia, and Hungary. Electricity prices soared. Heating systems shut down. Hospitals relied on backup generators. Protesters flooded the streets in freezing temperatures. "Why are we in NATO if NATO can't protect us?" they shouted. Energy had become a weapon, just as deadly as any missile, and Moscow controlled the trigger. In Washington, the National Security Council met in an emergency session. The Secretary of Defense proposed preemptively reinforcing Baltic borders with elite units. The Secretary of State advised restraint. Intelligence chiefs presented intercepted communications that suggested Russia was positioning itself for a limited incursion, an event designed to test Article 5 of the NATO Charter, the clause that mandates collective defense. Would NATO really go to war over a small border town, a rail line, a cyber attack on a satellite? Would they risk nuclear escalation for Estonia? No one knew, and that was the point. Putin wasn't gambling. He was playing poker with all the cards visible. He didn't need to bluff, only to wait. NATO would hesitate, just once, and once was enough. Then came the incident that would define the moment. A Russian surveillance aircraft flying over the Baltic was intercepted by a NATO jet. Tensions flared. Radio commands were ignored. Within seconds, warning flares were deployed. In the confusion, the Russian jet dropped a decoy flare too close to the NATO fighter, triggering a defensive reaction. Missiles locked. Warnings blared. For 4 seconds, the world stood on the edge of war. Then the NATO pilot disengaged. He returned to base. Crisis averted. Barely. But the Kremlin spun it differently. Russian media broadcast footage claiming NATO fired first. They showed doctored images of aggression. Within hours, the Russian public was whipped into patriotic hysteria. Volunteers flooded recruitment offices. State television spoke of the coming betrayal by the West. In Russian schools, children rehearsed emergency drills under the threat of NATO missiles. Back in NATO capitals, chaos erupted. Should they issue a denial, a counter-narrative, or act militarily? The alliance was split down the middle. The UK and Poland called for a strong military response. Germany refused. Italy abstained. France tried to mediate. The United States remained vague. The alliance had the weapons, but not the will. And so, Russia advanced. Unmarked vehicles crossed into a disputed zone in northeastern Estonia. Russian-speaking militias requested protection. Local officials were captured and replaced by Moscow-friendly administrators. No uniforms, no tanks, no declaration. Just a slow, creeping occupation under the mask of humanitarian aid. Would NATO invoke Article 5? The debate raged on live television. Some said yes. Others warned of nuclear consequences. Still others demanded evidence, clarity, verification. But the delay was the answer. In Moscow, Putin smiled. The West had built its power on the myth of unity, but unity built on fear was no match for conviction. Russia's moves weren't about tanks. They were about willpower. And NATO, for all its technology, had lost that will. This wasn't the Cold War. This was a new kind of war. No front lines, no declarations, no surrenders, just collapse from within. As the days passed, Eastern European countries began to panic. Hungary began secret negotiations with Moscow. Slovakia considered exiting NATO. Protesters stormed government buildings in Bulgaria demanding neutrality. One by one, the outer walls of the alliance began to crumble. It wouldn't take an invasion to destroy NATO. Just indecision, just fear. And Russia had all the time in the world.